This video covers adding twists to garments, both in the pattern making and in the 3D draping and arrangement. I show it both on a sleeve and on a dress so that you can easily apply it to any area of a garment. I'm showing these in knit fabrics because it is easiest to do them in knits. It's just easier if you're not working around darts. And with the sleeve can be symmetrical front and back, so that helps as well. You can definitely do it on an asymmetrical sleeve pattern, and you can get creative in how you work around your darts, but I don't show those things in this video. This is a visual overview of the pattern work that we'll do. I'm going to show you how to manually slash and spread in CLO and create your new pattern. In the end, I suggest using the sleeve in 2 pieces and the dress in 4 pieces, and then ultimately you can merge it all back together as one pattern piece. I'll give you a quick view of what my complete patterns look like for your reference. So my top is just a basic knit pullover top. It has a crew neckline and a pretty straight armhole. And like I said, my sleeve was symmetric with a pretty short cap because it's a knit. And my dress is just a basic silhouette. I did taper it in a little bit at the back waist. Otherwise, it's just kind of a crew neck, sleeveless, basic dress. So from here on, we'll pretty much only be working with the 2 patterns that we add the twists to. So the sleeve and the front dress body that I started with. Nothing else on your existing garment needs to change, and I highly recommend building your garment first in 3D and then adding your twist. Ideally, your patterns are symmetric, but if you have symmetry applied in CLO, you'll want to remove it. So with Edit Pattern, right-click on that center line and remove linked editing. Then I'm going to marquee over these center points and right-click to choose Join Overlapping Points. I want these to be one line. Then you'll use internal polygon to draw a line in the center. You want one central line and then one line on the sleeve at the elbow. I've drawn mine at the normal elbow marking, which is 7 inches below the armhole because my shoulder is a little bit dropped. But if your shoulder is higher, you may want to drop it down about 8 inches below the armhole. For the dress waist, we're going to drag this down and tap our right click and make the new marking 2 inches or 5 centimeters below the original waist. Then I'm just going to right click on the new line and extend it to the pattern outline. And now these patterns are ready to draw our slash lines. If you want to isolate your 2D window like I have, click the 2D icon at the bottom right. Our slash lines are going to slash across the central line in order to add fullness for the twist. So with Edit Pattern, I'm going to right click on this line and choose Split, and we're going to mark a point that is 1 inch past the center line. Now we have a point that's already at center, and we're going to right click and choose Split and Split by length to add 2 more points that are each 1 inch apart. So under number of segments, I'm entering 3. On the dress, the extension at center front is going to be 2.5 inches. So I'm going to right click on this line and split here at 2.5. These points are also all going to be spaced 1 inch apart. So since this one is 2.5 inches right now, I'm just going to hit it over 2 keystrokes to make it spaced 3 inches apart. Then I'm going to split the line and use uniform split into 3 sections. So now we have 4 points that are all 1 inch apart. Now with internal polygon, I'm going to draw a line from the top center to that furthest extension point and ending at the bottom center. So remember, you just left click to start and left click to add a point and double click to end. Now we're going to right click on one side of the sleeve cap and split and do a uniform split into 4 sections. We'll do the same thing at the hem, but only splitting it into 3 sections. On the dress, I'm going to add a point by splitting the shoulder into 2 even sections. Then grab your Add Point Split Line tool, and we're just going to eyeball adding a point kind of at the middle of this rounded part of the armhole here, and then about 1 inch below the underarm at the side. Then at the bottom, I'm going to eyeball one point just a bit below the hip, and one about 1 inch from the side seam at the hem. And then the other one, I can use my guide and put it pretty much straight down from that shoulder point. Now with internal polygon, we can connect all of these lines. I'm doing them as one continuous line, starting at the points at the top, connecting to those points spaced 1 inch apart at the middle, and then double clicking to end at the corresponding bottom point. And once your patterns look like this, we're ready to slash and spread. We're going to work on the half. Remember, we extended beyond that center line. So with my transform pattern tool, I'm going to select that furthest over slash line and right click and select cut. Then you can select those unmarked sides of the pattern and hit delete on your keyboard. Don't worry about the fact that you're deleting that central line. It's actually going to copy over and we can delete them anyway at this point. Now I'm going to select those horizontal center lines and actually all of my slash lines and right click and choose cut. But before you do this, I want to show you something up here in the settings. You should go to user settings and go to 2D on the left side. Here you'll see automatically offset 2D patterns when cut, and you want to make sure that this checkbox is off. You'll see when I cut mine that all my patterns stayed in place here, and that's what you want to happen. The next thing you need to do is go up to the information icon and make sure your rulers are turned on. Right click on the ruler to change the unit of measure because it won't necessarily match your current unit of measure. And then we're going to drag from the side to add some vertical guides. This works just like Illustrator. The main thing you want to do is just put it on an even number, just not a fraction of a measurement. Even if that means you need to move all your patterns over, just marquee over them and line them up at that very center point to the guide. I'll do the same exact thing over here for my dress. We've done the slashing. Now I'm going to show you how manually spreading patterns in 3D works. So you want to start by selecting the top patterns and double click this center point, which is your pivot point. Everything will turn orange and you're going to drag it down to the middle of the pattern at the center line and use your rotation wheel to line these up with your guideline at the front. So I'm going to do the same on the bottom. Double click the pivot point, move it to that center line, and rotate until I create my new center line. The real key to doing this accurately in 2D is selecting the patterns together and then how you move that pivot point and rotate. So now we're going to flare the rest of the patterns out by a specified amount, evenly across. So in order to do that, I need to add a guide at the edge of my first set of patterns. And then I'm going to put a guide at the distance that I want to flare it out. So in my case on the sleeve, I'm doing it 2 inches apart. And on the dress, we'll spread each one 2.5 inches apart. So starting with the top, I'm going to select the outer 3 patterns, move my pivot point, and rotate them out to my guideline. So I'm flaring it open by 2 inches. I'll do the same on the bottom. If you're familiar with flat pattern making, this will all make sense to you. You would cut these lines up to the pivot point and leave the tiniest bit still attached, and that's how you would be flaring these open, and probably using a ruler or tape measure to measure this area between the guides and taping it down on your table. I'm going to repeat the process, adding a guide at the edge of my previous pattern and then another one 2 inches away. This time I'll select just the outer 2 patterns and rotate them together. I'll do the last 2 on my sleeve, and then I'll repeat the process on my dress, again spacing them 2.5 inches apart. Once you're finished, you can right click on a guideline and choose delete all guidelines. Before we create our new pattern, I'm going to go up here to my fabric in the object browser and copy it. And then my existing fabric, I'm going to apply a faint color to it so that I can see it through my new pattern. Then I'll select my fabric copy and my polygon tool to create my new pattern. You may want to select all your patterns and right click to lock them. I'm going to leave mine unlocked so I can see them a bit better, but that's up to you. Now we're going to trace these patterns to create our new pattern. So if you're not familiar with the polygon tool, it works very similar to the internal polygon, except that you have to close the shape. So here I'm holding Control to create curve points, and I just click down to create a segment point. So don't worry about copying the line exactly. At the cutout, I'm just going to eyeball it and kind of follow the angle of those outer pattern pieces. The key will be to match these 2 lines so that they can sew together. After I close this shape and create the new pattern, I'm going to clean everything up and kind of true it up. Also, if you want to use this technique to see your pattern through the new pattern, then make sure that you're on this semi-transparent fabric view. First, I'm going to grab my Edit Curve Point tool and clean up my curves, just making sure that they're smooth and truing them up the same way you would on paper, where you kind of fill in at these harsh angles. Now we're going to try and even out the sides of this cutout. So with my Edit Pattern tool, I'm going to select this point and move it around, just eyeballing it and looking at the measurements of each line, trying to get them as close as possible to matching. Once they're super close, you can right-click on one and select Change Length and enter in the length of the other. I've found that this gets them within a tiny fraction of each other, in this case 0.003 inches, which is absolutely fine. If you're doing a dress, you're going to use the exact same method, using the polygon tool to trace out the pattern, and your Edit Curve Point and Edit Pattern tools to true everything up. Now I'm just going to select my new patterns and move them out of the way. If you locked any of your other patterns, you can right-click in the 2D background and unlock all pattern outlines. It's probably a good idea to keep these somewhere as a reference, but in my case, I already have lots of copies of these, so I'm going to delete my slashed and spread patterns. Now I'm going to grab my Smooth Curve tool, and I'm going to click and drag the corner of this cutout and tap my right click and round this out. I just decided to do it by about 1 inch. It's fine to leave this as a sharp corner if you're working in 3D only, but if you're producing this pattern in real life, you'll want to round it out to make it easier to finish this edge. On the dress only, I suggest shaving off a little bit at the hem to smooth out this side seam here. Using my internal polygon tool, I'm just kind of eyeballing here a smoother transition at the hem. The key here is I don't want this line going on and off and back onto the pattern. So I'm just moving some curve points to fix that. I'm going to show you a trick I like to use where I extend the line and add a point to the pattern outline. Then you can select this outer bit of the pattern and the line itself and right click and choose Replace as Pattern Outline. This is a really great trick, especially if you already have sewing on that side seam as well. Using Edit Pattern, I'll just right click and convert this to a curve point, and with Transform Pattern, I'll right click on the whole pattern and delete the reference line. Now with Internal Polygon, I'm going to draw a keyhole at the center front. This is going to allow room for the twist to happen. So mine's going to be about a 1/2 inch away from center front, and the key is that it starts a little bit above the cutout. So this is what mine looks like on my dress, and I'm just going to copy paste it onto my sleeve, placing it a little bit above the cutout, but in the same width. I need to trim my sleeve one to the pattern outline, but I'm also going to make sure that the one on my dress extends to the pattern edge. So I'll just do both. Then you can select them both and choose Cut. You can delete the keyhole bits, and then we're going to copy, mirror, paste our sleeve pattern. And the dress pattern we're going to cut in half at the middle of the cutout. So with my Edit Pattern tool, I'm going to right click in the middle of this cutout and uniform split into 2 pieces just to get the center of it. And then with Internal Polygon, I'll draw a line straight across. And back to Transform Pattern, I'll right click on the line and choose Cut and Sew. Then I'll select both pattern pieces and clone Symmetric Pattern with Sewing. Before I go through how to drape and arrange this in 3D, I just want to give you a bit of an understanding as to what's happening with the pattern. So if I click on the bottom right portion of the pattern in 3D, you'll see that that is also the bottom right portion of the pattern in 2D. So what's happening is this area is crossing over the other side and going through this cutout and then coming back and sewing to everything that it would sew to normally. You'll see that either side of the cutout sew together up to a point, leaving a bit of a keyhole here for the other pattern to go through. That's why we round this part of the pattern out, because that ends up being open and you need to finish it some way in real life. You'll see in the end we do merge the pattern back together at center front to create one symmetric pattern. But that happens at the very end. And this bottom keyhole portion always stays open. It sews together up to a point, but at the very top you still need a keyhole for the patterns to pass through each other. This portion here that we merged together but was a separate pattern piece, that is all of this area that is really gathered through these keyholes. If we zoom in on this center front keyhole and you have a look at the sewing, you can see how far up it goes. It's trickier to sew this super close in 3D, and this opening would probably be a little bit smaller in real life, but this gives us a good enough visual, and it's not important that you sew it the exact same amount as you would in real life. The sleeve is the same story, just on a smaller scale. So you'll see this seam here is the cutout, and it sews together up to a point, leaving that little bit of a keyhole. On this example, I didn't round it out, but like I said, if you're producing it in real life, you should round it out. Here you can see where these 4 corners meet at the sleeve inseam, which is made up by these 2 seams. Just like the dress, this area here is the bit that's gathered through the keyhole, and essentially this part of the pattern wraps across and goes through the cutout on the other side and then comes back and sews to itself. And of course I could merge it together at this center seam just like the dress, I just haven't. We're going to start with the sleeve just because it's the easier one. There's really only 3 secrets to doing twists, and they involve these 3 settings, but all I'm going to say is that they're not a guarantee that you won't struggle a bit. Just like tying knots, these things just take practice, and I completely struggled with the dress a lot, and I just had to fumble my way through it until I figured out what worked. So I'm going to show you that on the dress, but just know that there's no real secret sauce to this. So here I've added the sleeve pattern that we created to my existing top, which is already draped on my avatar. I recommend that you select the pattern together, both pieces, and use your gizmo to arrange it. You just kind of center it over the arm, and then we're going to minimally sew it together. So using free sewing, I'm just going to sew my sleeve cap to my armhole. Remember, these are a knit. There's a bit of ease, but it's just kind of distributed all the way around. And then I switched to segment sewing and just sew together this center seam at the top of the sleeve. You'll notice here that everything is currently in low res, which is 20 particle distance and 2.5 collision thickness. So that goes for my sleeves as well, just at this stage. Before I simulate, I'm going to strengthen my sleeves by right-clicking in 3D. The strengthening will help work out all this excess, and you can also use your hand tool to help pull the sleeve inseam down under the arm. Once you have these 2 pieces clear below the arm, we'll sew together just this top portion of the sleeve inseam. You'll notice I'm keeping it strengthened so that the pattern stays nice and stiff, and I use my hand tool to kind of separate the 2 sides so that I can straighten out these bottom edges of the sleeve. Then we're going to grab our pin box tool, and I'm going to zoom way in on the pattern and double click a point on this bottom side edge, and holding shift, I'm going to then double click a point on this edge as well. The reason I hold shift is then it will create 1 set of pins. So I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side. So you'll have 2 groups of pins, 1 on each side. Now you can unstrengthen the patterns with Ctrl H or Command L. Before beginning the twist, I'm going to put the particle distance down on the sleeve patterns to 15. If you're trying to speed your computer up, you can select the rest of your garment and deactivate it in 3D. Just make sure that you choose pattern only and not pattern and sewing, because you want to keep it attached to the sleeve. If your computer speed isn't an issue, I recommend actually freezing your existing garment instead to avoid any collision issues here at the underarm where the sleeve might pass through the deactivated garment. With simulation turned on, you're going to use your pins and your gizmo to cross one side of the sleeve over top of the other. And then we need to wrap this selected one down under this one again, back to where it started. But I can see that my pins are kind of too long here and getting in the way. So with my pin box tool, if you click down in the 2D background and hold Control, you'll get a little minus symbol that allows you to remove pins. So holding Control, I'm just going to marquee over this set of pins on either side of the sleeve. Now I can wrap these one more time. And make sure that you're constantly changing your perspective and use the rotation wheels on your gizmo to straighten things up. I'm going to put my particle distance down to 10 as things get pulled tighter against each other here. You'll notice that I still have my collision thickness at 2.5, but I should have already put it up at this point. I ended up putting it up a bit later. So especially if you can't bring your particle distance down this low, I would increase your collision thickness here to 4 or 5. In order to straighten out the sleeve inseam here and get it sitting where it needs to be, I'm going to add a single pin by holding the W key and then clicking down. I use that single pin and my set of pins to straighten up that side of the sleeve, and then I also added a single pin to the same spot on the other side. To get my bearings and make sure I was twisting this all in the right direction, I turned on textured surface view so that I could see the backside of the fabric, which gets grayed out in this view. So then I knew how to rotate my pins and fix this to put the backside of the fabric in towards the body. Now I'm going to right click and delete my single pins. Now I'm going to use free sewing to sew my cutout closed up to about this point. So I just eyeball it and then use my blue dot on the other side as a guide. I'll do the same on the other side, sewing up to the point where I start to get to the fullness of the twist. Now I'm ready to delete the rest of my pins and sew this bottom portion of the sleeve inseam closed. I'm just going to hope for the best here with how it's a little bit behind the arm of the avatar, and you can see I can strengthen the pattern while it's simulating to help work some of that out. I use another single pin to straighten out this last corner, and you can see how much you can affect with just your hand tool. So I start sewing up this center seam just a tiny bit and kind of pull it open as I go with the hand. Using edit sewing, I drag the sewing up a bit further, and this is the point where I increased my collision thickness on the sleeve patterns up to 4, but as I mentioned, I would suggest doing it from the start. I use another single pin to kind of fix this area where the backside of the fabric is really showing. And then I use that same technique of dragging the sewing with edit sewing and using my hand tool to pull things out of the way. I do it both here at the center seam and then also to tighten up the keyhole at the cutout. Once I get the twist this tight, I put my particle distance down to 5. Then I step my collision thickness down from 4 to 3.2. You don't want to take it down too far too fast. I decided that the keyhole in my center seam was up too high and I didn't like it. So using my edit pattern tool, I selected the top portion of the keyhole and dragged it down. In total, it was a 1/2 inch. Now I assign my sleeve to my main fabric and then step the collision thickness down to 2.5, and I wouldn't make it any lower than this. At this stage, you can select these center lines with edit pattern and right click to merge the pattern if you want to. Now we can right click and clone symmetric pattern with sewing, which is what you always want to do in situations like this because the way that it's draped will copy over to the other side. The dress is the same, it's just a bit more difficult because of the weight of the panels. So you'll see I started here with it sewn at the shoulder and the side seam above the waist, and the front dress panels themselves are sewn together at the top of center front. You may notice I already have elastic applied to my back dress at the armhole and neckline. I'm going to apply elastic across my front neckline as well, and the ratio is set to 100, which acts as Mobilon tape to keep it from stretching out. I highly recommend this due to the weight of the garment, and you don't want that weight pulling more on the twist. At the armhole, I have my ratio set to 98, just because this is a knit, and you normally would kind of ease it in at the armhole. You definitely want to work with the dress in 4 sections, and one of the tips I have for you is using this multicolored fabric view that will make each panel a different color so you can tell what you're doing as you make your twist. I suggest starting with your particle distance at 15 and put your collision thickness up to 4 or 5. I'm not going to go through the entire process all over again with the dress. I suggest you watch me go through the sleeve one for the basics, but what I will go over are some of the differences and especially some of the tips I have for how I dealt with some of the challenges in the dress. You'll see the twisting process is remarkably similar. You'll see I put pins only along the bottom edge of the dress, and I did end up needing to put single pins on those corners to flatten out the front panels, very much like I did on the sleeve. At this stage, I changed my top panels from 20 particle distance down to 15, and the skirt panels I changed from 15 down to 10 as the twist was starting to get tighter. Once I get the gist of the twist done, I delete my pins and I also froze the back panels of the dress. Then I'm going to use my sewing to pull the dress together. I sew up the skirt side seam and then I sew the cutout closed up to a point. Because this pattern is symmetric, remember the cloned copy will also sew. I sewed up that center keyhole at first, but decided that at this stage it was too risky and I wanted to get the twist right, so I actually ended up deleting this before simulating. I tried simulating a couple of times and had some collision issues. I think actually freezing the top panels caused me some problems instead of helping me. But what you'll see is that you can use your gizmo to rotate your patterns after they're draped a little bit. You want them to have at least some shape to them, but then you can rotate them around to make sure that nothing is overlapping at the twist. Before simulating again, I increased my collision thickness to 4 on the top panels, which I had previously only done to the skirt. One thing that can help on the dress is applying elastic to these segments that get gathered in the twist and just kind of helping them to gather further. So I checked elastic on and applied it at a 40 ratio, which is quite tight. My patterns continued to pull through each other at the twist, and I tried a lot of different things to fix it. I changed the drape of my fabric, choosing different fabric drapes from the property editor. I did a lot of rotating the panels until they weren't colliding, and I even tried select mesh a bunch of times. In all of these attempts, as soon as I simulated, they would start colliding again. I actually didn't have this problem on my practice round of this, only on the one that I recorded. So at this stage, I'd even tried putting all of my front patterns in particle distance of 5. So if you feel like you've tried everything with your collision thickness up to 4 or 5 and particle distance down between 5 and 8, then you might find that this solution works. This is the only thing that worked for me in this case. Using my edit pattern tool, I selected my cutout here and dragged it over and increased it 3/4 of an inch. I decided that I probably just had too much fabric trying to gather in the twist and that it was just pulling hard against itself. So I needed to increase my cutout, and that's the only thing that finally worked for me. The rest was exactly like the sleeve, where I tightened up my keyholes by dragging the sewing tighter and tighter with edit sewing and using my hand tool to move the fabric out of the way. Then I went through the same process of stepping my collision thickness down in small increments. In this case, I went all the way up to 6, and I stepped it down to 5, and then 4.5, and then 4, 3.5, 3, and then stopping at 2.5. The key is simulating after each change and checking that you don't have any collision issues. If you do, stop the simulation and do edit undo. And as long as it looks okay to you, then you can keep it higher if you need to. All it means is that the twist won't sit as closely together.